Good morning, class. We are continuing with our social studies chapter 11. Let's look at what we are learning about in chapter 11, our key terms that we've gone over. First one is industrialization. What is industrialization? Ryan.
The process of developing large-scale mechanical factories.
Developing those large-scale mechanical factories. So industrialization is the big factories. What is an industry, Sam?
A specific branch of a service or something.
A specific part of that business, that service or good. So in our chapter, it's titled flour, lumber, and iron. Those are three big industries for Minnesota. Who is an industrialist, Ethan? An owner or manager of a big business. It's got that IST, so we know it's a person, and it has to do with the industry. So it would make sense that it's the owner of that business. What does it mean to invest, Adrian? To put money into something, hoping to gain profit from it. Remember, there's always risks, just like with the land speculators. They put money into the land, hoping they would get a big profit out of it. Investors in businesses put their money into the business, hoping to grow the business. There's always a risk associated with those investments. Sometimes they pay off really well, like we learned about with Charles Pillsbury, like we learned about with Weyerhaeuser and the lumber. So some investments pay off really well, but there is a risk associated. What is a bushel, Paul? Cubic feet. So it's that unit of measurement for agricultural crops. We don't use bushels to measure across our floor. Okay, bushels is a cubic feet, 1.25 cubic feet. So that means it's a volume. Okay, when you cube something, that's length times width times height. So we're cubing it. Best example I have is the basket they give you at an apple orchard. They have it measured out to be 1.25 cubic feet. So they know that if you fill that basket, it's 1 bushel of apples. All right, iron ore, Ryan.
Rock or mineral from which iron can be removed.
That rock or mineral from which the iron can be removed. So when you go out into the nature, you can find the iron ore. That's the rock, especially up north on the Iron Range. They take that rock and that's what they take the iron out of. All right, so yesterday we did start reading about the lumber. So we're a little bit ahead of schedule. So we started with Weyerhaeuser. Who can remind us what we learned about Frederick Weyerhaeuser? What did we learn about him, Peyton?
That he first started he was from Germany. He moved to the United States, and then he saw how much trees they were, and asked a friend or someone. So he partnered up with them.
So are you guys collecting the money? Okay, so she does want you. So Peyton, you can.
Don't steal it. I won't, Sam. I'm not that mean.
Okay, so as Peyton was saying, Frederick Weyerhaeuser came from Germany. He was an immigrant from Germany. Who remembers how old he was when he came?
18.
He was 18. So the age of high school seniors. So he was 18 when he came over here. He worked some odd jobs for a few years. And then he decided to buy a lumber mill in Illinois. And then he was realizing, he and another investor were saying, we want to make sure that we have the lumber to send through our mill we want the trees to be able to send through to cut up into the lumber. What did they do that was really smart, Sam?
They bought land in Wisconsin, and then they just cut down all the trees.
They bought land that had the trees on it. So they said, instead of just waiting for people to bring the trees to us and having to pay their prices to get the trees, why don't we just get the trees ourselves? So they bought the land that the forests were on. They bought up a whole bunch of land in Wisconsin and cut down the trees that they could use to make lumber. But then the not so smart thing was they cut down all the trees in Wisconsin. They cut down a bunch of trees and there was no more white pine trees left. Instead of replanting the forests, they moved on. Where did they move to after Wisconsin, Paul? They moved into Minnesota. They were like, oh, look at all the white pine trees up here. We learned about with the Ojibwe. Northern Minnesota had all those white pine forests that they would stay in the wintertime. And so we know that there's lots of pine forests. So they came in and said, hey, let's make sure that, yeah, that light's blinking. It kind of threw me off. Let's get that land. What other smart thing did they do then once they moved into Minnesota? How did they help grow their lumber industry, Naveen?
They bought the railroads.
They bought the railroads. They said, ooh, not only do we want the trees and cut them down, and then we want the lumber mill to cut it all up, the sawmill, then we want the railroads to be able to send them out. We want to own all the parts in the production of the lumber. So they controlled all the costs and the fees and the profit of all the parts to the lumber. So instead of just having that sawmill, they had everything that went with it. All right, let's look at, at the end of yesterday, we talked about why the rivers were so important. We know the waterfalls, just like with the flour mill, were important because that water falling down helped generate the energy for the machines. Why else was it important to be by a river, Ethan? Yeah, they were able to send the logs downstream. The current carried the logs down, so it was an easy way to transport these big, long, heavy trunks that they had cut down. All right, so we are on page 227. We're going to learn about the machines that they used. So 227. Cross-cut saws, axes, logging chains, and hooks had long been important tools of the lumber trade. However, as the years went on, people invented new machines to make the business more efficient. The hot water pumps kept the water near sawmills from freezing so that mills could run all winter. Faster steam-powered saws with circular blades helped increase lumber production. Few improvements, however, were as important as the railways. So they were making better improvements to the actual sawmill, but the improvements to the railway were even more important. At first, most logs were hauled to rivers by horses and floated downstream to the mills. As more and more timber was cut, it became more difficult to find pine forests near the rivers. In the 1890s, lumber companies started using trains to move logs out of forests that weren't near rivers. They often built temporary tracks used only to haul out the massive pine logs. After all the logs in an area were shipped out, the tracks would be moved to the next forest. So think about those train tracks. They had the train tracks going to the forest because it wasn't near a river for them to float the logs down. So they made train tracks go there. Once that forest was cut down, they pulled up the train tracks and they moved them to the next forest. So they didn't leave the train tracks on the ground. They said they moved the train tracks to the next forest. So they didn't have to get new railroad ties. They just picked them up and moved them to where they wanted to go to next. I actually never realized that they moved train tracks that easily. Interesting. All right. Look at that cartoon. A glimpse into the future, the last tree. How many of you have seen the Lorax? Yeah, quite a few of us have seen the Lorax. This reminds me of the truffalo trees. Okay, they kept cutting down the trees, and they kept cutting them down because they wanted to make the truffalo something or another.
It's like a scarf.
It's the clothing. They wanted to make the clothing out of the truffle trees, and then the trees were all cut down. So that's what we were talking about in Wisconsin. They cut down all the pine trees and they moved on to Minnesota. They cut down all the pine trees in Minnesota. They're going to move on to somewhere else. And pretty soon there's not going to be any more pine trees left. And everybody's going to be racing trying to get that last tree. Thank goodness we've learned and we know that we don't just cut down, we have to replant. Okay, so we've learned in the last 150 years how to be better. But even back then, people were worried about it. This is a cartoon from that time. People were worried that they were cutting down all the trees. Look at the picture up top. Loggers started their day at about 4 a.m. in the bunkhouse they shared with up to 20 other men. Meals were served in the dining hall where all the men in camp fueled up for a long, hard day of work. Why do you think they were starting at 4 a.m., right?
Because they wanted to eat before they started work.
They wanted to have time to eat. What time does the sun come up?
6, most likely.
So in the summertime, it's more like 5:30. Okay, so especially the farther west you go, the earlier that sun is rising. So they wanted to be up and have eaten and be ready to go, be at the logging site by the time the sun was up so they could use all the daylight to cut down the trees. So they had their lunch out there. Maybe they even had dinner out there. I'm not sure. They wanted to use that daylight when they had it. So they would get up early so they could be out and ready to start as soon as the sun was up. The people. The lumber industry employed lumberjacks in the forest and sawmill workers in cities and towns. During the winter, when the ground was frozen, lumberjacks cut down trees and hauled them away. During the spring, the logs were transported to sawmills. In the early years, workers floated the logs down rivers to sawmills in places like Minneapolis, Stillwater, Red Wing, and Winona. Later, trains carried the logs to sawmills in cities like Virginia. At the sawmills, workers ran the machines that turned the logs into lumber. Jobs in the lumber industry paid well, but they were often hard and dangerous. Just like it was dangerous to run the machines in the flour mill, some of the machines in the sawmill were dangerous. It was common for lumberjacks to suffer serious injuries while cutting down trees with axes and saws. Those who helped to drive the logs downriver had to be careful not to fall in the water where they would drown or be crushed by all those logs. So the lumberjacks would actually stand on the logs as they're floating down the river and make sure there weren't any log jams. So if a log accidentally turned in the river, it could get stuck, and then the logs all trying to get through would be jammed up behind it, and they would have to push the logs to make them go straight again so they wouldn't get jammed up on anything. But as these logs are moving on the river and going in the current, the logs are moving, and the lumberjacks had to balance themselves. So if they lost their balance and fell in the water, think about a river that's full of moving, big, heavy logs. Okay, if they fall in, there's a good chance that they could drown or get crushed by all of those logs. So it was a dangerous job. Working with the machines, dangerous jobs like we talked about with the flour mill, same reasons. Cutting down the trees. If you don't cut the tree down the right way, it could fall in the wrong direction and fall on top of people. So you had to be very aware of how you're cutting down a tree, how you're angling it, so you could direct the tree to fall in a certain direction. Are you done? So working in as a lumberjack, working in the sawmills was dangerous. So the pay was pretty good because you're paying that hazard pay. You're paying them because they're risking their lives, they're risking their bodies. By 1910, in the mills with their whirring saw blades were dangerous places too. So just like the flour mill, your hand could get crushed or torn off. In the sawmill, they've got blades that are spinning. And if you're not careful when you're putting in the log, if maybe your glove got stuck on something and it got pulled in to where the blade was, I mean, there are ways that they could get injured. Now we have more safety features on machines because people were getting injured. So we've learned a lot over time, but when something is brand new, you don't know what the risks actually are until people start getting hurt. Then you can work on preventing those accidents. By 1910, lumber production in Minnesota was beginning to decline. Minnesotans started talking seriously about conserving trees and planting new ones. But by then, it was too late. Many sawmills in Minnesota were closing. Logging operations were moving west to forests that had not yet been cut down. Men who wanted to continue working as lumberjacks had to follow the companies west. Others turned to harvesting different kinds of trees, and the rest had to find new work. Once it was clear that Minnesota was running out of white pine, Frederick Weyerhaeuser left and moved his business operations to the state of Washington, where there's even more pine forests. So here he is cutting down all the white pine in Wisconsin. Now he's cutting down all the white pine in Minnesota, and then he's moving on to Washington. So hopefully people were saying, hey, we need to be replanting. If you go up north, there are pine forests. So he didn't cut them all down. It was able to regrow. So enough was left for it to regenerate, but it's been 150 years. Okay. Now we know that as we cut down, we need to replant right away. So next industry, Henry Oliver and the iron mining industry. Iron mining is an expensive business that requires investments made by people willing to take tremendous financial risks. So we've talked about those investments are risky, but they can pay off big time. So we learned about Louis Fertile, who made the big risky investments with the land speculation, and he made lots of money off of it. Charles Pillsbury made that investment into the failing flour mill, and it paid off. Frederick Weyerhaeuser made the risky investment with the sawmill, and it paid off. Not all of these investments pay off. People lost money. So you have to be really careful making those investments and making sure you have a sound business plan so that it'll work. Some of the first people to put their money into the state's iron mining industry were Minnesotans who hoped to become rich. Many, though, were wealthy industrialists from eastern states. Of all the out-of-state businessmen who invested in Minnesota's iron mines, Henry W. Oliver may have been the most influential. Oliver owned a steel manufacturing company in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He wanted to find a reliable source of iron ore because iron was needed to produce steel. So they use iron when they make things that are made out of steel. Think of all the things in your life that are made out of steel. Look in our room. Look at just in this room, all the things that have metal. Okay? Iron is pretty important. In 1892, he found that source in northern Minnesota. He started investing in a few of the small iron mining companies that had begun operating on what was known as the Mesabi Range. Mesabi comes from an Ojibwe word meaning giant. So it was a big range. Okay, so it was a huge space of land. And now the Mesabi Range, we just shorten it to say the Iron Range, the range. Okay, people know what we're referring to up north. It's the official name is the Mesabi Range. Within a few years, the Oliver Mining Company was the biggest and most successful iron mining business in Minnesota. Oliver was rich, but he wasn't rich enough to pay for a big mining operation all by himself. He raised much of the money he needed by making business deals with two of the wealthiest men in the world. Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller were based in the northeastern United States. Carnegie had made his fortune in the steel manufacturing business, and Rockefeller made his millions in oil, railroads, and shipping. Both men invested large amounts of money in Minnesota's iron mines. So those are really big names that you may have heard of. How many of us have heard of Carnegie or Rockefeller? Okay, a few of us have heard of them. They were big industrialists of the time. So they were mega millionaires. They made a lot of money. And so because they had all this money, they were able to invest into other businesses, into other industries. So they could see the benefit of the iron mines, of mining for that iron. So they invested into that because they could see that it would be beneficial. Under an agreement made in 1896, Oliver, Carnegie, and Rockefeller agreed to split up control of the iron mining business in Minnesota. Oliver's company continued to operate the mines that produced the iron ore. Rockefeller's railroads and shipping lines carried the ore away from the mines. Carnegie's factories in northeastern states turned the iron ore into steel. It was an arrangement that made all three men even richer. So we had Frederick Weyerhaeuser, who said, I want to control all the aspects of the lumber production, from the land that has the trees on it, cutting the trees down, bringing them to the sawmill, to shipping them on the railroads out to wherever we're sending them to. I'm going to control it all. So it was different with the lumber industry. We had three big industrialists that each capitalized on one section of it. So we had Oliver controlled the iron mines, actually mining for the iron. And then you had Rockefeller, who controlled the railroads that would transport that iron that they had, the iron ore. And then you had Carnegie, who had the factories that were able to turn that ore into the steel. So even today, you'll see a lot of the cargo trains coming down when they're going south on the railroad tracks. A lot of them are carrying that iron ore from the same range. There's that much. That's why it's called the Mesabi, the giant. 150 years later, it still has iron ore that it's contributing. Okay, you can still mine for it. So it is a huge range with iron ore. So that's why Mesabi is a very fitting name, because it's such a giant range. We are going to stop there. We will read more about the iron mining tomorrow. We've been going about every 2 weeks with having our test for social studies. So we're kind of we kind of went slow in the fall, and now we're picking up our pace to try to get through these chapters and learning the most that we can learn about Minnesota history. So keep in mind that this is our first week on it. So that means next week, by the end of next week, we're going to be testing on this. So we will have an activity that we're going to do next week, but we will have the test next week. And I want to have that test done before spring break, so we're not trying to remember all of the information after spring break. So I'm thinking Thursday or Friday of next week will be our test. So just keep that in mind, that there is a test that will be coming out next week on this information. So be refreshing your memory on flour and lumber, and now we're learning about that iron. All right, with that, we're going to say goodbye to our friends at home. We hope you are well, and we hope to see you soon. Have a wonderful day.